We are trying to do everything that we can to make it easier for folks to cast a ballot.
The politicians that are involved in election, they always say, just trust us. But a lot of the citizens were saying, show us the data.
I don't see anybody trusting the elections. I don't see the Reds trusting elections because of voter fraud. I don't see Blues trusting the elections because of voter suppression. What happens when Reds and Blues actually listen to the concerns of each other?
I'm Julie Rose, and this is Top of Mind. I have been a radio journalist for 2 decades, but a few years ago, I found myself avoiding the news for long stretches because of how depressing and divisive it all seems. I still wanted to be informed and engaged on important issues, though, and I figured I couldn't be alone in that. So we created this podcast. Each episode, we tackle one tough topic in a way that will challenge you, help you feel more empathy, and empower you to become a better citizen, a kinder neighbor, and a more effective advocate. Today, a troubling trend in the public's trust of U.S. elections.
I had utmost faith in our election system.
This is Lenny Mira.
I was a state representative in Massachusetts, one of the very few Republicans in Massachusetts, having first got elected in 2012.
Mira spent 10 years in office, and for most of that time was fully confident in the integrity of elections. No concerns about fraud or corruption.
People in my party complained about voting machines like they're hacked or something. No, the machines are perfectly accurate, and we always have that paper ballot backup.
But Mira's confidence took a dive in 2022. And his story shows just how easily confusion can give way to distrust in a complex and changing system. The trouble began on election night, his last bid for re-election.
We won by 100 votes, which is very close, because there's over 20,000 votes cast. So it's like a fraction of 1%.
But it wasn't over, because Massachusetts, like many states, had expanded its use of mail-in ballots since the COVID pandemic, and a lot of those still had to be counted. In the days that followed,
the lead had been whittled down from 100 votes down to just 10 by the time the recount came around.
10 votes was tiny, but Mira still felt pretty confident. He'd been through recounts before.
Our recounts are usually very well run. They don't usually change the outcome by more than maybe 1 or 2 votes. And so we went to a recount, and during the recount, there were also a lot of inconsistencies in 2 of the towns. They have 6 towns, but in one of them, in Ipswich, they found 14 extra ballots at the recount.
Now, it's not unusual for a recount to end up with a slightly different total, but 14 votes seemed like a lot to Mira, and most of them were for his opponent. Town officials couldn't explain where those extra votes had come from, so doubts were beginning to take root in Mira's mind.
We went into Ipswich up by 10, and by the time we were down there, it was just a 4-vote lead going into another town, Rowley, right next door. And in Rowley, they found 10 ballots that were improperly discarded. And so my opponent was able to dig through that pile of 10 ballots and pull out just 5 of them.
What happens in a recount is that election clerks meet in public with candidates and their lawyers present, and they go back through every single ballot that was cast. Candidates can challenge decisions about ballots on the spot, but election officials have the final say. With ballots that come through the mail, there tend to be more judgment calls to challenge because you've got voters filling them out at home with shaky hands and leaky pens, occasionally making mistakes that they try to correct with new scribbles. At several points in the process, including with those 10 ballots in Rowley, Mira's team felt officials made the wrong call.
They kept changing the rules and how they interpreted those ballots. So if there's a stray mark next to your vote, it gets counted sometimes and sometimes it's not, or the oval that you fill out isn't filled out all, and they kept changing the rules, and that's how the election was decided. My opponent won by 1 vote.
A cascade of confusing moments and unanswered questions shattered Mira's confidence in the system. So he filed an appeal to have several dozen of those contested ballots reconsidered.
And we ended up before a judge, but even the judge didn't even want to hear it. He said, no, it's not my jurisdiction. I'm not going to look at this case. And finally, it goes before a special House committee, which under our Constitution is the last word on elections.
So that State House committee had 2 Democrats and 1 Republican. And they decided 2-1 that they were not going to be in the business of, quote, calling balls and strikes on challenges to individual ballots. And they warn that doing so, quote, unnecessarily opens the door for potential future mischief from unscrupulous candidates seeking to impugn the integrity of the Commonwealth's elections.
So it went before the full House on February 3rd, 2023. Democrats have like 85% of the seats. And every Democrat except one said, no, we're not going to look at the ballots. Every Republican said, yeah, we need to look at them. And I walked out of the chamber, and that was it. We conceded the election that day, February 3rd. And a lot of people on my team were angry and disappointed that we conceded the election. And they were asking me, why would you do that? You know that there's a bunch of ballots that never got counted. Why would you accept a one loss? I said, it's for a lot of reasons. Number one is because we said we would accept the outcome of the election. We were asked numerous times by media, by people in both parties, are you going to accept the outcome of this election? And every single time we were asked, we said, yes, absolutely. There's a process, there's a recount. You can go to court to protest it. But once that's over, we said, that'll be it.
But in your heart and your mind, you were thinking that fraud had taken place?
No, it wasn't. I don't think it was fraud. I think it was just human error. And it wasn't corruption. We want to make clear. I told everyone on my team that we're not going to go around saying stolen election. I said, do not use those words. First of all, I don't think any of our presidential elections were quote unquote stolen. Not 2016 when Trump won, nor do I think 2020 when Biden won. Go all the way back to 2000 when George W. Bush won. A lot of Democrats said that was stolen. And I don't think any of those presidential elections were stolen. Okay, and by the way, they all had their days in court. I never got my day in court. The judge simply wouldn't look at our case. So what we want is for our Secretary of State to just do an investigation. It's not going to change the election. The election's over, so this is not about any past election. But what we want is for our Secretary of State to look at the flaws in our system that allowed this to happen in the first place so that it never happens again. Because what happened in our case it wasn't just bad for me, it's bad for the whole process because now people have doubts about our election system.
Only 44% of Americans say they have a great deal or quite a bit of confidence that the results of the 2024 election will be accurate, which means more than half of us are walking around with pretty serious doubts. But party affiliation is a big part of the story, because if you break down that 44%, only 1 in 4 Republicans have high confidence, compared to nearly 3 out of 4 Democrats. It's always been true that when your candidate wins, you're more confident in the outcome. After Al Gore lost to George W. Bush in 2000, for example, when the outcome was so close the U.S. Supreme Court made the final call, Democrats were expressing far less trust in the election system. When Barack Obama won in 2008, trust among Republicans dropped off steeply. And when Donald Trump won in 2016, you guessed it, Republicans were once again more confident than Democrats. But 2020 brought something new. Former President Trump's refusal to concede and his persistent assertion that the election system cannot be trusted have driven Republican confidence to a new low. And efforts by Republican state lawmakers to address perceived gaps in election integrity are undermining confidence among Democrats who worry that eligible voters will be disenfranchised. It is a vicious cycle of mistrust. But a representative democracy like ours relies on all voters having a high level of confidence in the results of an election, no matter who wins. Without it, people stop voting. Losing candidates don't concede, winners can't lead effectively, and the transition from one administration to the next is no longer guaranteed to be peaceful. So, today on Top of Mind, how can all Americans regain trust in our elections? For Catherine Ruski, the answer is a lot of one-on-one time with voters.
I am the city clerk for City of Oak Creek, Wisconsin.
Oak Creek is a predominantly Republican suburb of Milwaukee. Ruski's been in charge of elections there for 12 years, during which she has sensed a deterioration of public trust.
There are so many myths to debunk, where in the past, I think we had just a general faith in our process, where good or bad, now that's being challenged and people want to know more, which I encourage. If someone comes to me with a concern, I will stay on the phone or talk to them face to face until I am 100% positive they understand how our process works. It's very important to me. My integrity is my job. So I think what's concerning the most here in my municipality and from what I've seen in the media is people truly believe that we aren't managing how we enable a voter to vote. And that comes down to, that's the first step is voter registration. There's a lot of talk about illegal, people who aren't U.S. citizens registering to vote. How are you checking that? People that are voting more than one time, how are you checking that? So each one of those breaks down our election process in the perception of the public.
Now, part of what voters in the U.S. are grappling with is a huge change in the mechanics of our elections. Prior to 2020, most Americans voted in person on Election Day, and partisan debates around election integrity centered mostly on how to be certain that only eligible voters were casting their ballots. But when COVID hit, states had to figure out how to keep people safe from an infectious disease while voting. Doing it from home seemed like an obvious solution, and most election clerks had at least some experience mailing absentee ballots to people who were unable to vote in person on Election Day. Now they were looking at the majority of votes in a highly contested presidential election being cast by mail. Who should get those ballots? How would election officials verify and count those votes? Could the mail be trusted to deliver ballots on time? Where would the drop-off locations be? Would those boxes be tamper-proof and secure? And since U.S. elections are run on a state level, different plans popped up all over the country. Officials like Catherine Ruskey raced to implement them while contending with a lot of mistaken ideas about the potential for mail ballots to be forged or tampered with.
And the challenge to that for me is where are these people getting the ballots from? And how are they being tracked, and how are you able to count a ballot that isn't mailed in an official certificate envelope? It's just really not realistic to think that somebody all of a sudden can produce 10 ballots that will be counted without the appropriate certificates attached.
And how, do you have people who come in and say, how do you know that the actual eligible voter filled out that? How do you know it wasn't, maybe they moved or it was a family member or someone stole it out of the mailbox and voted on it and then faked the signature and sent it in? Like, how are you able to be sure that that ballot was filled out by the actual eligible voter for whom it was intended?
So part of Wisconsin's process is on that absentee ballot envelope. We print out the label that has their barcode on it, our tracking information, all of our information on there. When they vote their ballot, our instructions advise them that are included in the ballot that they must sign that they were the person that voted their ballot. They're also required to have a witness that actually observes them voting, not for who they're voting for, but that they voted their ballot. They sign as a witness. They print their name, and they have to print their address on the envelope. So those are the things that are required when that ballot envelope and that ballot is returned to us.
And you check every signature, like you literally open it up, you look at their account, make sure that the address matches, like you're checking all of that.
We're checking all of that, yep. If any of those items are missing, we are required to return that ballot to the voter to correct, otherwise the ballot is rejected. If we have a phone number, we will call them immediately for them to come in if they'd like to correct the ballot that way. If we have an email address, we will attempt that way. But we are required to mail that ballot back to them should we not be able to get a hold of them. And then they have to return it back to us for the vote to be counted.
So that is how Ruskey allays concerns about the security of voting by mail when Oak Creek voters call her directly. But a major driver of confusion is that every state has different rules, while a lot of information people get about our election system comes from national candidates and news outlets. So in Wisconsin, for example, a voter has to request an absentee ballot, whereas some states will send mail ballots out to every active voter automatically. If you don't know the rules in your state, you might be suspicious if a ballot just shows up in your mailbox. Deadlines differ too. That is a big point of confusion. Some states require mail ballots to be received by Election Day. Others will count them as long as they're postmarked on Election Day. In some states, it's legal for a third person, say someone working for a political campaign, to go around and collect or harvest sealed ballots from voters and bring them to an election office to be counted. In Wisconsin, that's not legal, but Rusky hears a lot of concerns about it anyway. And then there is the vote count conundrum on election night, where mail ballots get added to the tally in big batches that can cause a sudden swing in the results, fueling doubt and confusion.
The city of Milwaukee during the 2020 election had over 40,000 absentee ballots to process in 13 hours, 7 a.m. to 8 p.m. And it's physically impossible to do all of your checks and balance on those envelopes and process all those ballots and get a result at 8 p.m. It's not going to happen. It's unrealistic. We aren't allowed to start working on those ballots before Election Day, which I agree with. That's when your vote should be counted. So when central count came in for the city of Milwaukee during that election, everyone still talks about it. There was a big dump of vote counts that went to this direction well after the polls had closed. Yep, because central count was still processing. So that's where it's really hard to explain to people. It's a long explanation. It's not very simple just to say, yep, there's a reason for that. I just want to say to people, do you want your results right now or do you want them accurate?
Do you wish that didn't happen?
Yes.
You would prefer if it was just like, give us a chance to get the final tally, everything, that we've done all our checks.
That's the way it used to be. And in a swing state, those votes are critical and they are very impactful. So I wish that there was more of an elections 101 opportunity. One of my goals is to step up my adult education. I talk to second graders. I talk to fifth graders. I work with the local high school AP government classes, local colleges to bring in my poll workers. I go in and speak any opportunity I can. I do civic events. But I would really like to further now an adult education type course on election administration because I think it would further that one-on-one discussion, which is what we're doing here today, too, I hope, is sharing some of that information.
Catherine Rusky is the clerk of the city of Oak Creek in Wisconsin. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you for your time. I really enjoyed myself.
It's increasingly rare to find an elections official who's been on the job as long as Rusky has. Many long-timers have switched fields or retired early because of the increased scrutiny and political attacks they face. 1/3 of local elections officials in the U.S. are so new that 2024 is the first presidential election they've administered. And some of those newcomers even rode this wave of election mistrust into office.
I was kind of a protester trying to find election integrity, so I ran for county clerk.
And now he's an election official trying to convince voters to trust the system. We'll hear his story next on Top of Mind from the BYU Radio Podcast Network. I'm Julie Rose. Hey friends, I would like to take just a moment and introduce you to another show from the BYU Radio family of podcasts. It's The Lisa Show. Lisa Valentine Clark is the host. She's a comedian, actress, believer, single mom. And the show delves into the multitude of challenges that shape our lives, whether it's parenting, mental health questions, social issues. Lisa and the Council of Moms will tackle it and do it with a lot of laughs along the way as we attempt to figure out this thing called life. So check out The Lisa Show. Listen wherever you get podcasts. Aaron Davidson first got serious about politics during the pandemic.
It was during the mask mandates and vaccine mandates, and I kind of knew that those masks didn't work, so I kind of protested.
Then the outcome of the 2020 election got him focused on election integrity.
The politicians that are involved in election, they always say, just trust us. We've got clean, safe, and secure elections. Just trust us. But a lot of the citizens were saying, well, give us some of the data. Show a lot more data.
Davidson is a Republican, as are the vast majority of voters in Utah County, which is about 30 miles south of Salt Lake City. He announced his bid for county clerk with a promise to audit more election results and to get rid of universal voting by mail.
I thought it was possibly fraught with errors and that you should vote in person.
Utah is one of just 8 states and the only one that's majority Republican, with universal mail voting, where ballots are automatically sent to active voters every election. Counties in Utah started embracing mail voting about a decade ago, and it was hugely popular among both voters and politicians until 2020, when mail voting became a lightning rod for conservatives concerned about voter fraud. But as soon as Aaron Davidson pledged to end voting by mail in Utah County, he got an earful from voters.
There's a lot of constituents that say, don't you dare take away my mail-in balloting process. It's too convenient. And it is.
So he backed off his plan to eliminate it. And when he took office in January 2023, he says he tried to give vote by mail a fair look, despite his doubts.
I had to stay completely open-minded when I came in to get the facts rather than, make these rash decisions based upon my beliefs.
He discovered that the mail voting process had been pretty finely tuned by his predecessors over many elections. It was more trustworthy than he'd thought. And so was the system of verifying and counting votes. Now he's in the rather awkward position of trying to ease those same concerns in others.
Now that I understand the process a lot better, it's kind of conflicting because, I knew how I used to feel and now how I feel now, because I do have more confidence in what we do in the process. And I believe that we try to, I'm not to say we try, we do run a clean election.
But the lack of trust Davidson once felt is also driving many of the changes he's implemented.
I've increased the number of ballots that we audit. The state mandates that we do 1%. So I always double the amount that are requested by the Lieutenant Governor's office.
An audit is not a recount. It's more of a quality assurance spot check to make sure that what voters marked on their paper and electronic ballots matches up with the votes that were recorded. Typically, it's done by staff in the election office.
So I actually advertise when the audit is, and I ask for regular voters to come in and do the audit themselves. And actually last year, during the municipal elections, there was a big controversy in the Orem School District split. And I offered to the cities, any municipality that wanted to come in and do a more extensive audit, I would let them handle the ballots and count as many of the ballots that they wanted to. And so there were some citizens from the city of Orem, and I allowed them to come in, and we audited about 25% of their ballots. And they found, after 25%, and they weren't finding any discrepancies, they finally agreed that, yes, it was handled properly.
And that put it to rest.
That put it to rest. I never had another question about that election.
Aaron Davidson has also put a lot of focus on plugging some of the weaknesses he sees in voting by mail, particularly securing the entire path or chain of custody that a ballot travels from a voter's house back to his office.
When I first came into office, we had somebody that was in charge of maintaining the drop boxes.
Voters in Utah County can either return a ballot through the mail or put it in an official drop box.
And I saw an invoice come through for some new keys made. So I don't know who's had keys since they put those drop boxes in and why they had to make new keys. So I replaced every lock in every drop box with these special type of circular keys that can't be replicated. And then when we send people out to the drop boxes, we send them out with 2 sets of keys so that they can open the box. And if any one of those keys ever disappears, I'm going to replace the lock. And that to me was very important. And then we have videos on every single drop box.
The video surveillance is required by state law, as is the 2 people handling the ballots at all times procedure, which brings us to the part of the mail voting system that is most problematic for Davidson.
The chain of custody is completely lost when that ballot is turned over to the Postal Service. I don't know who's handling those ballots.
But the Postal Service, there are federal laws that prohibit tampering. These individuals are professionals who take oath to uphold the laws of the land that you can't tamper with. And we entrust a lot of really important things to the U.S. Postal Service. So why would we not trust them in this one particular case to deliver the ballots?
Why don't you trust my employees to go out by themselves to go pick up the ballots in the drop box?
I guess I would, but it sounds like you don't.
Well, it's state law that I have to have, two people there. But so why don't we do that with the U.S. Postal Service?
There have also been some problems with ballots in Utah being postmarked too late, even though the post office had them on time. The bottom line here is that every minute a ballot spends with the Postal Service is a minute that ballot is outside of Davidson's ability to personally vouch for its handling. So, starting with the 2024 primary election, Davidson stopped prepaying postage for mail ballots.
It's kind of a couple different reasons. One, I was trying to encourage the use of in-person or using a drop box. The other one is that our county is actually operating in a deficit this year, and our county commissioner said, hey, look for ways to save money. And I found that, we could definitely save money.
How much money did you think you would save?
Doing my calculations, I thought we would save about $100,000. It might be a little bit less than that. I thought our turnout was going to be a little bit higher for the primary.
Now, critics warned Davidson's decision to stop prepaying postage would confuse and deter voters. Turnout in his county ended up being about 10 percentage points lower than the last presidential primary in 2020.
So we probably didn't save as much as I thought we would save, but we still saved about $25,000 this past election.
Do you think that you suppressed the turnout by not making it as easy as possible to return that ballot by including a stamp?
I don't think we did, because the only complaints I've heard from people that, you're suppressing voter turnout are people that were trying to claim that I was suppressing it from other people, but anyone that was incapable of getting a stamp or whatnot, they're not the ones that were calling me. It was always somebody that was concerned about somebody else not being able to use it.
Right. But oftentimes the people who are disenfranchised also have less ability to make the phone call, don't have time during work hours to call, or they're not typically the ones that are going to be engaged in that way, but their vote still, they still have a right to vote. And if it's being suppressed, they're not necessarily going to be the ones that are going to call you. It'll be somebody else calling. So.
Right. And I think there's enough. There were basically three politicians that were advocating, you don't have to put a stamp on it. The federal government requires county clerks to pay for it anyway, so don't worry about it. And which is absolutely true. The federal government, there's a federal law that says the Postal Service cannot not deliver a ballot envelope if it does not have a stamp. And even with that, we still save money by us saying we don't pay postage.
So, but is your job to run elections in the cheapest way possible? Or
you mean to try and save taxpayer money?
Yeah. Like, how would you describe your sort of primary responsibility as an election, as the clerk in charge of elections in Utah County?
I think it's to run a safe and secure election and to do it at the most reasonable cost possible.
Is it your responsibility to increase turnout?
My responsibility is to increase voter registrations, but the turnout, I think that's the responsibility of the candidates and other advocacy groups.
Why not yours? Because there are election officials who feel like their job is to make sure that as many people who are eligible to vote will vote. Why do you think it's not for you?
I think it's not for me because most of the advocacy groups are to try and get out the vote are partisan. And I viewed that my responsibility is very nonpartisan. And so if I'm out advocating the same way other people are advocating, it's to get a certain demographic out. So we do some drives, but I feel my responsibility is making sure that the ballots get out to everybody. The voter roll is my responsibility, keeping that as clean as possible. And I just can't do everything. And so my emphasis is more on cleaning the voter roll, keeping the dead people off, all that stuff, keeping the non-citizens off, and keeping the addresses clean, trying to track down the people that move that don't tell us that they move. We do our best at that. But if I were slated with the responsibility of advocating to vote, it just splits my time.
What's keeping you up at night as you head into your very first presidential election as an elections administrator?
The thing that gives me the most thought is how do I enhance the cure process to make it even better?
The cure process is when there's a problem with a mail ballot, and election officials reach out to the voter to give them a chance to fix or cure the ballot so that it can be counted. In the 2024 primary election, nearly 3 out of every 100 votes cast by mail in Utah County needed to be cured.
There were 2,582 people that did not sign their ballot with the signature that we had on file that looked identical, or they actually didn't sign it. So if we have an email address form, we send out an email, and I watch that pretty closely because I did a lot of that myself. If we don't have an email address form, or if their email hard bounced, we then send a letter out to them. And then if they don't respond after that, we send out either another letter or we start calling them. So we had 2,582 of those ballots that went through the cure process. And we cured 955 of them. So 1,627 people didn't get their ballot counted because they just didn't sign it properly. So that to me is more of a disenfranchisement of voter than saying, put a stamp on it. I may have stopped maybe a half a dozen people that didn't vote because they couldn't get a stamp. But here through the legal process, I didn't count 1,600 ballots. And we tried.
And so what's the solution to that?
Voting in person completely eliminates that. Because the signature verification, it's not a science. It's a very difficult process sometimes to discern what's a valid signature and what's not.
To that point, a review by the Utah Lieutenant Governor's Office, which oversees elections in the state, concluded that Davidson's team was too stringent in their signature review during the 2024 primary, which led to ballots being challenged unnecessarily. Now, Davidson disagrees that his team was too stringent, but he's stepping up training for his staff on signature verification and making plans to better track their efforts at contacting voters who need to cure their ballots. He also hopes to have a system in place for the general election where voters can still use a mail ballot, but avoid the signature verification process completely.
They could receive their ballot at home, fill their ballot out, and bring it to an in-person. Show up, show your ID, sign the poll pad, and deposit your ballot.
I can just show my ID. It doesn't have to go through the curing process.
You can show your ID. We see you in person. We see the photo. So you can just sign it. 0, they have to be, cured.
He calls it fast cast voting, and it's really his best case scenario. Voters get the convenience of studying and completing their ballots at home, but they verify their identity in person, ideally without waiting in line, since they don't need to use an electronic voting booth. But Davidson has some wrinkles to iron out because during the 2024 primary, fast cast resulted in several instances of people submitting mail-in ballots at in-person voting locations without going through the ID verification. State election officials concluded that fast cast created an environment where fraud could happen. They're working with Davidson's office to see if the security problems can be resolved. And speaking of voter fraud, Davidson's position on that has changed too, now that he's on the inside.
Yeah, it has. I don't think that in Utah, I think we run a pretty good, secure election. I can't answer for other states. There's a lot of media out there saying, these things happen, and there's even some meetings I've gone to here just out of curiosity, and they tell about all these things that they found in other states. And I just kind of hate that. It's like, don't come to Utah and talk about all these problems that are happening in other states. Go there. If you think that there's a problem here in Utah, come and address it in Utah.
So voter fraud is not as big a problem as you feel like people speak about it as?
Not in the respect that they keep coming up with these things. If it's happening, I don't know how it's happening.
So what would your advice be then to citizens who are wary, who have a lack of trust in whether or not their vote can be appropriately counted and the outcome will be fair?
I would say spend more time advocating for your candidate and less time worrying about whether the process, at least here in Utah, I'm not going to talk to any other state. Go out and start advocating for your candidate. Do everything you can. And just, I hate to use the word trust the system, but trust and verify, because I'm gonna publish as much as I can and let people be as involved as possible. Audit my process, but start advocating for your candidate more and more.
Aaron Davidson has been Utah County Clerk since January 2023. The 2024 general election will be the biggest test yet of his ability to encourage trust in the system he himself deeply doubted not that long ago. Now, despite his message of confidence to Utah County voters, there are aspects of his approach that some on the political left may find troubling. The insinuation that voter fraud or election mismanagement might be happening in other states, for example, or the emphasis on getting people to vote in person with ID. Even the notion that citizens should be encouraged to question election outcomes raises a red flag for people concerned that conservative politicians are trying to narrow the right to vote. There is a fundamental tension between the political right and left in America over whether our elections need to be more secure or more accessible.
Access to the ballot is one of the most powerful ways for ordinary folks to have their voice heard.
Jay Young is Senior Director of Voting and Democracy for Common Cause, which is nonpartisan, but opposes election policies that are often sponsored by conservative lawmakers, such as limiting vote by mail or requiring a photo ID to vote.
We believe that, the more representative our systems are, the better that they will work for people. So, we are trying to do everything that we can to make it easier for folks to cast a ballot.
How hard should states work to make sure that cheating is hard? If it was on a spectrum between completely secure versus completely accessible, how do we balance that appropriately? Would you rather see us kind of lean in the direction of let people vote or make sure they're not cheating?
The evidence is that voter fraud does not happen in anything close to what the assumptions that are behind this cheating narrative. It simply doesn't happen. In every state, it simply doesn't happen at those levels. The things that are underlying those concerns, I'm not going to say they're not legitimate because I'm sure you feel strongly about them. But I'm telling you, it's not based in fact. Knowing that, my tendency would lean towards accessibility and not the things that make it harder, particularly for specific certain populations to vote. So,
who are those populations?
In terms of the folks who get hurt the most, students, military families, disabled voters, people who speak maybe English is not their first language that they speak in the home. People who don't have steady housing, people who are in a domestic violence shelter, people who move around a lot.
And there is a legacy in the United States of suppressing the votes of people of color. But partisans on the right deeply distrust the motives of advocates pushing for more access, since young people, immigrants, and people of color have traditionally supported Democrats. So our lack of trust in elections is tangled up in the deep mistrust Americans harbor toward our political opponents. Is it even possible to find common ground on this?
We had 26 workshops around the country, equally divided red-blue. The sum total of all the points of agreement that those workshops came up with was 727.
What did those conservatives and liberals agree could rebuild trust in U.S. elections? We'll find out next. I'm Julie Rose. This is Top of Mind, a BYU Radio podcast.
Hey, Top of Mind listeners, I have another podcast I want to recommend to you. It's from the BYU Radio family of podcasts, and it's called The Appleseed. It's a show filled with stories for you and your family. Each episode features master storytellers sharing all kinds of stories, folk tales, fairy tales, personal and family tales. So it's perfect for road trips, for bedtime, or really anytime you're looking for something that the whole family can enjoy together. And the stories you'll hear will likely get your family sharing their own stories with each other, which is really the best part. It's the payoff. So listen to The Appleseed wherever you get your podcasts.
My name is Rena Bernards. I live in Tacoma Park, Maryland, which is right outside of D.C.
Bernards is a therapist and an early member of a national nonprofit called Braver Angels, which was founded shortly after the 2016 election to work on depolarizing America's politics. In 2020, Bernards was tapped to lead a series of cross-partisan workshops to find common ground on the issue of trust in elections.
The president of Braver Angels, David Blankenhorn, gave me a call one day, and he said, "Rena, I don't see anybody trusting the elections. I don't see the Reds trusting elections because of voter fraud. I don't see Blues trusting the elections because of voter suppression. And if people don't trust the elections, we are left with nothing."
Bernards and a leadership team consisting of an equal number of conservatives and liberals, or Reds and Blues in Braver Angels lingo, organized 26 workshops around the country. Each workshop involved about 16 people, again, equal numbers of Reds and Blues. That's a feature of everything Braver Angels does.
So what happens in the Common Ground workshop, it starts out with exercises where Reds and Blues get to know each other. And then the secret sauce is that we go into 2 rooms and each comes up with values, concerns, and solutions around ensuring trustworthy elections. And then we come back, share the lists, and everybody gets to have a veto in terms of what becomes the final points of agreement.
Did you think that there would be much common ground to be found when you embarked on this project?
My experience with Common Ground workshops in Braver Angels is that you always can find something. And I trust that people that come to the workshop with goodwill, it's not for everybody. It's for people who are really willing to talk to the other side and listen to the other side. And one of the things I like to say is what we came up with in this report is not like a Gallup poll. It's not like if you polled Reds and Blues, you'd come up with these points of agreement. It's what happens when Reds and Blues actually listen to each other and listen to the concerns of each other, which is very different than just asking a person off the street, how do you think election reform should happen?
Over a 3-year period, those workshops yielded 727 points of agreement. The leadership team coalesced those into a report with 23 specific recommendations for rebuilding trust in U.S. elections, which they released in February 2024. We'll link to that report in the show notes. Bernard says they hope it'll be a roadmap for state chapters of Braver Angels to use with their local lawmakers and election officials as they work to build trust in elections.
One of the things we all agreed on was that gerrymandering shouldn't be happening, political gerrymandering, and that really politicians shouldn't be picking their districts. People should be picking their politicians.
So what's the recommendation then in the report?
The recommendation was that there should be no politicians involved in forming the districts. It should be done by an independent commission.
How did the group address the concerns around the risk of voter fraud?
Well, we said that voting should be easy to do and hard to cheat. That was one of our upfront values. We say in the report that cheating is rare.
And the Reds were willing to agree to that then? This is something that both sides of your group agreed to?
Yeah. And one of the things that we did was we didn't look backwards. We didn't try to relitigate the 2020 election. What we did instead was, if you were to, whatever you think happened, if you were to fix it, what would you suggest? That was our premise. We're not going to go, we can't decide that. We'd probably argue forever about it. But okay, you were uncomfortable with what happened. What do you think should happen?
So in addition to facilitating, you also participated. Where do you fall on the political spectrum?
I'm definitely blue. Yeah.
Okay. So what is a recommendation in this report that felt like a compromise for you, that took some work for you as a blue to sort of get on board with?
So I would say the toughest one was around voter ID. And I came in to the process thinking that voter ID is just a form of suppression. It's a voter suppression. It's not necessary. It's not needed.
Tell me a little bit more about that. Everybody has some kind of ID. What was it that felt to you like it was suppression about? Can you just flesh out your concern a little more if you could?
Well, it's actually not true that everybody has a government ID. I think it's a good 10% of the population doesn't. In minority communities, it's higher. So what happened over the course of the campaign is I began to see that voter ID was something that made logical sense to everybody, reds and blues. There were blues that were concerned about voter suppression, for sure. But there's sort of a natural sense that when you go there, you should be able to identify yourself. You have to do that when you get on, public transportation or whatever, airplane. So what I decided, given the strength of the sentiment for voter ID, is to try to figure out a way that it will not be as much a suppressant of the vote. And so what we came up with is that the government is responsible to issue an ID to all eligible voters, a free ID, and that it does not have to be a photo. And the Reds did not object to it when we came up with that. I'm sure that they would prefer a photo, but, we said that would be enough. It could be photo or non-photo.
And that's the nature of compromise then. I guess neither of you got like really, really what you wanted. But
that's probably true. We listened, we called it not compromise, but collaborative consensus. So we collaborated, we came up with something that took everybody's concerns into account, and that's how it worked.
What else did you have to struggle with in this report?
So voter ID for sure, issues around mail-in ballots.
Listen, a lot of Republicans are against it. They think it's a big scam.
This is Lenny Mira again, the Republican former Massachusetts state representative we heard from at the start of the episode. He joined Rena Bernard's on the leadership team of the Braver Angels Trustworthy Elections Initiative, in part because of the confusing role that mail ballots played in his election loss. The group wrestled with whether to recommend all states adopt mail voting, but Mira says they could not agree.
I prefer voting in person, but I trust the mailing system if it's done correctly. A lot of states do it. Republicans do it, I think, in Florida, and they have no problem winning elections there. But they do it right in Florida. They have backups. They have security systems in place to make sure that there is no fraud or no cheating. And, I think what it is that conservatives, by nature, as their name implies, they want to conserve what we had in the past.
Ultimately, the Braver Angels group kind of skirted the issue by recommending that if states choose to do mail voting, they should be certain that the entire chain of custody is secure and allow voters to track the status of their ballot. The report also urges elections officials to make sure that drop boxes and in-person polling locations are widely accessible and well-staffed. That's a recommendation Mira says conservative members of the group initially thought unnecessary, but they listened.
And the Reds were shocked to learn that in some places in America, there were so few voting locations that people had to wait in line for hours, 2, 3, 4 hours to vote. And, they had never heard this news before, and they were outraged over it. They were just as angry as the Blues about that, because that is voter suppression. It was done on purpose. I mean, these people that set these voting locations up, they know how many people are voting at a location. And if you try to reduce the number of locations so that there are long lines, 2, 3, 4 hours, you're going to reduce the vote count on that in that district, because some people can't wait 3 or 4 hours. That they just can't do it. They have jobs. They have lives. I wouldn't wait that long. And I'd be outraged if I had to. And so I'm so glad we put this together, because one of the things we agreed on unanimously was to make sure there's an adequate number of voting locations. Even if we have to add locations on election day because the lines are long at one location, we even agreed on that, believe it or not.
What was the hardest point for you to agree on in this report?
One thing Blues were big on, they said we should have a holiday for Election Day. Like, we need to declare another national holiday. And so I'm from the world of small business. I was in the construction industry for 30 years. And, you're already burdening small business with a whole bunch of days off and holidays and vacations. And now here's one more. And, I'm a conservative. I always thought we never had Election Day holiday before. Our, democracy has been in place for over 200 years without a problem. But, after talking to a number of Blues, they just said that for some people, they have a hard time getting that day off. And they work a shift that is in the middle of the day and it's long and they got kids that got to take to and from school. And it makes it harder for them to vote. If we declare a holiday, then everyone will be guaranteed a right and an ability to vote. And so I think that was the hardest part. And yeah, I caved on it because if it increases the number of people being able to vote, then I'm all for it.
The Braver Angels report ends with a set of recommendations around the need for a peaceful transfer of power. They urge candidates to sign a pledge to support the final election results once all claims of irregularities are submitted in good faith and resolved by the courts.
Which was, by the way, the pledge that we put in there. That was not controversial.
Rena Bernards says it seemed clear to both Reds and Blues in the group that trustworthy elections require all candidates to commit to accept the outcome prior to the vote.
Because if the politicians are going around saying that they're not going to accept a losing, result, people will feel like, well, why should I go vote? How would my vote count if the politicians are not going to listen to who won and who didn't?
And it's equally crucial that losing candidates concede, says Lenny Mira.
They have to. I am not happy with my fellow Republicans still going around today saying that 2020 was stolen. We've done every investigation. We have multiple court cases, recounts everywhere. And when that's over, you got to concede. Even if you still think deep down that you had your election stolen from you, you need to concede because the country needs to move on. You are not bigger than the country. You're not. Nobody is. Not a president, not a former president, not anybody. We need to have a peaceful transfer of power. Absolutely vital.
Lenny Mira, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it.
No, thank you for having me on. It was a pleasure to talk to you about it. I appreciate this opportunity, Julie.
Lenny Mira is a Republican, former Massachusetts state lawmaker, and a member of the Braver Angels Trustworthy Election Campaign leadership team, along with Rena Bernards, who is a Democrat and creator of the Common Ground Workshop. You can find a link to their report in the show notes for today's episode. And if you're interested in more about Braver Angels, they're at braverangels.org. Also, if you have questions about how voting works in your community, a great place to start is vote.gov. Plus, most election offices are happy to give public tours of their facilities and allow you to be present as they're testing voting machines or preparing ballots or counting them on election night. You can also be a poll watcher, which is someone who attends an in-person voting location on Election Day to see how things play out. Just contact your county clerk or election office. So, you heard the journey this episode took me on, and I would love to hear what resonated with you. Send an email to topofmind@byu.edu. Let's connect. You can also connect with me and the show on social media. Look for Top of Mind Pod. And by the way, the Braver Angels ethos of staying curious and open in conversation with people across the political aisle is central to our new show called Uncomfy, Sticking with Moments That Challenge Us. We've been featuring stories of real people navigating big political and personal differences these last few weeks. And I've personally gained some great insight into how to do it better in my own life. As a fun bonus, it's also a video podcast. I'd love to have you watch or listen and chime in with your own Stick With It story. Just look for Uncomfy, Sticking with Moments That Challenge Us on your favorite app. Top of Mind is a BYU radio podcast. Today's episode was produced by me and Jacob Smith, with help from James Hoops, Samuel Benson, and Sam Payne. Our audio design and engineering team includes Gabe Vargas and Brandon Lewis. I'm Julie Rose. We'll talk soon.